The air in the Boston Clinic waiting room was the color of old dishwater gray, sterile, and smelling faintly of bleach. It was the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, just empty, punctuated by the rustle of a magazine page or a dry cough. I was just another 71-year-old woman waiting for a routine checkup, a ghost in a beige cardigan. Then my phone buzzed, a harsh vibration against the hard plastic chair. Angela, my only daughter. I answered, a small, hopeful smile already forming on my lips. Angela dear, what a surprise. There was no warmth in her reply. Just the clipped, efficient tone she used for business. Mom, hi, I don't have much time. Ethan and I are flying out tomorrow. Tomorrow? The word caught in my throat. Flying where? You didn't mention a trip. Europe. It's a work thing for Ethan, a big deal. We'll be gone for a while. A pause, not for my response, but for effect. I just wanted to give you a heads up that I've taken care of a few loose ends for you here. Gwooks. A cold knot began to form in my stomach. Angela's loose ends were never small. They were decisions she made for me, presented as favors. What kind of loose ends? Well, the Cape Cottage, for one, she said, her voice breezy, as if discussing the weather. It's been sitting empty for so long, just a money pit with the taxes and upkeep. I found a buyer who made a great cash offer. The sale is closed, it's done. The room tilted. The Cape Cottage. My cottage. The small, salt-weathered house where my husband, Robert, had taught Angela to swim. Where we'd spent 40 summers watching the tide roll in. The scent of salt and sunblock, the feel of sandy floorboards under my bare feet, it all rushed back. A ghost limb I hadn't realized was still there until she told me she'd amputated it. My breath hitched. Angela, you sold the cottage? It was the smart move, Mom, practical. She bulldozed on, impatient. And I got rid of that old car of Dad's, too. The Mustang. If the cottage was a limb, the Mustang was Robert's heart, still beating in the garage. His cherished 1967 Ford Mustang. He'd spent a decade restoring it, his knuckles always scraped and stained with grease. The low rumble of its V8 engine was the soundtrack of our weekends. The last time I saw him truly smile, he was behind the wheel, the summer sun glinting off the polished chrome. He'd looked over at me and winked. Still got it, Annie, he'd said. And now Angela had gotten rid of it. Like it was trash. A loose end. My hand, holding the phone, began to tremble. Not with weakness, but with a cold, clarifying rage. The part of me that had spent a lifetime making excuses for her, she's busy, she's stressed, she means well, died right there in that sterile waiting room. She hadn't just sold a house and a car. She had taken a flamethrower to my history, to Robert's memory, and called it spring cleaning. The stories we share are about moments like these, the turning points that redefine a life. They remind us that strength often comes from the deepest wounds. But before we continue, make sure you've subscribed to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching this video from. We're really happy to know that our stories have reached people everywhere. I stared at a water stain on the ceiling tile, my mind racing. She had no legal right. My name, and only my name, was on the deed to the cottage since Robert passed. The car was willed directly to me. This wasn't a loose end. This was theft, wrapped in the language of concern. Mom, are you there? Angela's voice was sharp with annoyance. I said, it's all handled. I swallowed the betrayal. I swallowed the scream that was clawing its way up my throat. I let the silence hang for a moment, let her feel a flicker of uncertainty. When I finally spoke, my voice was unnervingly calm. Quiet. I see. Good. I knew you'd understand. It's for the best. That's when I let a single, sharp stone drop into the placid pond of her arrogance. You think you've tidied everything up, Angela, I said, my voice a stranger to my own ears, hollow and cold. But there are foundations. Things you know nothing about. For the first time, She sounded hesitant. "What are you talking about?" "You'll find out," I said softly, and I ended the call. I lowered the phone, my hand steady now. The trembling had stopped. The waiting room snapped back into focus, the drone of the air conditioner, the muted chatter from the reception desk. Everything was the same, but I was different. She thought she was leaving a frail, grieving widow behind. A mother who would swallow this latest cruelty, just as she had swallowed all the others. She thought I was a loose end she could tie up and discard. She had no idea that she had just handed me the scissors. And I was about to cut her loose. I walked out of the clinic like a woman in a trance, leaving the receptionist calling my name behind me. The appointment, my blood pressure, the well-meaning hum of institutional care, it had all evaporated, rendered meaningless by a single phone call. The gray Boston sky pressed down, but for the first time in a year, the weight I felt wasn't grief. It was gravity. It was the solid, anchoring pull of purpose. My car, a sensible sedan that Robert had insisted on for its safety ratings, felt alien. It was a capsule of my recent life, quiet, predictable, and insulated. But as I gripped the cold leather of the steering wheel, my knuckles white, the insulation shattered. The sounds of the city, the distant wail of a siren, the rumble of an Orange Line train, the impatient honk of a taxi rushed in, sharp and clear. The world had come into a brutal, high-definition focus. The drive back to my small house in Jamaica Plain was a journey through a graveyard of memories. Every corner held a ghost. There was the park where Robert and I used to walk, his hand a warm, steady weight in mine. There was the bakery where I'd bought Angela's favorite black and white cookies after school, her face always lighting up with a gap-toothed grin. For the past year, these memories had been soft, blurred with the watercolor wash of sorrow. Now, they were jagged shards of glass. Each one reflected my daughter's face, smiling, while her hand was in my pocket. How had I not seen it? The slow, creeping erosion of respect. The way her suggestions became directives. The way she spoke of Robert's things, our things, as burdens she would graciously manage. I had mistaken her avarice for practicality, her cruelty for efficiency. I had told myself this was the modern way, that I was the one who was out of touch. I had made myself small to accommodate the vastness of her ambition. As I turned onto my street, lined with the familiar three-decker houses and old maple trees, a specific memory broke through the surface of my anger. It was sharp, painful, and suddenly, critically important. It was from 3 days before Robert died. The hospice nurse had just left. The house was submerged in that unique, heavy silence of impending loss. Robert was propped up in the bed we had moved into the downstairs living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the quilt. He was so thin, a pale shadow of the vibrant man who had built our life with his bare hands. But his eyes, when they met mine, were as clear and lucid as ever. "Annie," he'd whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He gestured to the nightstand. "Hand me that envelope, the one from my desk." I picked it up. It was a simple, thick manila envelope, unmarked, sealed with a strip of old tape. It felt heavy, substantial. I held it out to him, but he shook his head, a tiny, frail movement. "No, it's for you." His fingers, cool and papery, closed over mine for a moment. His grip was surprisingly firm, a final, desperate act of will. "Don't open it now," he'd commanded, his voice gaining a flicker of its old strength. "There'll be a time for grief, and you need to give yourself that. Don't let business get in the way of it. But when you're done grieving, when you feel like you're ready to stand on your own 2 feet again, open it. Open it when you're ready." Then, I'd just nodded, my throat thick with unshed tears, and slipped the envelope into the drawer of the nightstand. In the whirlwind of funeral arrangements, the crushing weight of solitude, and the fog of the year that followed, I had completely forgotten it. It was a final instruction from my husband that I had failed to follow. Or maybe I hadn't been ready. Until now. Angela's call, in its calculated cruelty, had done what a year of quiet mourning could not. It had ended my grieving. It had forced me to stand. I parked the car in the driveway, the crunch of gravel the only sound. The house looked exactly as I'd left it that morning, a bastion of quiet widowhood. But as I walked up the 3 short steps to the front porch, I saw it with new eyes. It wasn't just my home, it was a fortress, and its walls had just been breached. Inside, the air was still and cool. I walked past the living room, averting my eyes from the empty space where the hospice bed had been. I walked past the gallery of family photos on the wall: Angela at her graduation, Angela on her wedding day, Angela and Ethan smiling from a dozen vacations I had helped pay for. They were all lies now, props in a long and masterful play, and I had been the unwitting audience, the devoted fan, the financial backer. I felt a sudden, violent urge to rip them from the wall, to shatter the glass and tear the smiling faces to pieces. But I didn't. That was spectacle. What I needed now was strategy. Robert's study was at the back of the house, overlooking the small garden he had so meticulously tended. It was the one room I had left almost entirely untouched since his passing. It still smelled of him, a faint mix of old books, pipe tobacco, and the cedar of his desk. It was a sanctuary, and the only place in the world I still felt his presence. My heart was a frantic drum against my ribs. I had answered Angela's call with a cold, hollow voice, a promise of a reckoning she couldn't comprehend. But what did I have? I was a 71-year-old woman with a fixed income and a dwindling savings account. She had the money from the cottage and the Mustang. She had youth, aggression, and a complete lack of sentiment. She held all the cards. "Open it when you're ready." Robert's voice was a whisper in the quiet room. He was a planner, a man who thought 5 moves ahead in every aspect of life. He was a quiet man, but his silence was one of observation, not absence. He'd never fully trusted Ethan. He'd found him charming but shallow, a man who was more interested in the appearance of success than the hard work of achieving it. And he had watched Angela, his beloved daughter, fall under his spell. He had watched her change. I moved to the nightstand that now stood beside my own bed, having moved it from the living room after he was gone. My hand trembled as I pulled the drawer open. There it was. Tucked beneath a stack of old paperback mysteries lay the thick manila envelope. It was just as I remembered. Anonymous, heavy, waiting. I lifted it out. The paper was dry and cool to the touch. I sank onto the edge of the bed, my legs suddenly weak. This felt like a betrayal of his final wishes. He had told me to take my time, to heal. But Angela had set a new clock, and its ticking was deafening. My healing was a luxury I could no longer afford. My survival depended on what was inside this envelope. I looked at the simple, sealed flap. For a year, I had been defined by what I had lost: my husband, my partner, my future. I was Anne Parker, the widow. A figure of sympathy, a woman adrift in the quiet eddies of her later years. Angela saw that woman and thought she was an easy mark. She had sold my past and stolen my husband's legacy because she believed my future was irrelevant. She believed I was already finished. My fingers found the edge of the taped flap. The tape was brittle with age. I could hear Robert's voice again, not a whisper this time, but as clear and solid as if he were standing beside me. "When you're ready, Annie." A single, hot tear escaped and slid down my cheek, but it wasn't a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of rage. A tear of resolve. I was ready. With a slow, deliberate motion that felt like the most important act of my life, I began to open the envelope. The old tape surrendered with a dry, crackling sigh, a sound that seemed to echo in the profound silence of the room. The flap of the manila envelope felt stiff, unyielding, as if protecting its secrets even now. My breath was a tight knot in my chest. For a full year, I had been navigating the landscape of my life as defined by Robert's absence. Now, I was about to navigate the one he had built for me in secret. I tipped the envelope, and its contents slid onto the faded floral of my bedspread. It wasn't a landslide, but a neat, orderly cascade. The sheer volume of it was the first shock. This was no simple life insurance policy or a sentimental letter. This was a file. A thick, heavy, formidable stack of documents. My fingers, still trembling slightly, reached for the topmost papers. They were deeds. Not copies, but original documents, the thick, vellum-like paper cool and official to the touch. I scanned the first one. A commercial property on a numbered street in South Boston. I'd never heard of it. The next was a duplex in Cambridge, then a small apartment building in Brookline. Page after page, address after address I didn't recognize, each one titled not to Robert Parker, but to a name that was sterile and unfamiliar. Parker Holdings LLC. I set the deeds aside, my mind a confused swirl of legal terms and unknown locations. Beneath them was a sheaf of brokerage statements, bound with a simple rubber band that had gone hard and brittle with time. I slipped it off and it snapped, the sharp sound making me jump. The statements were from a private wealth management firm, a name I'd only ever seen in the glossy pages of magazines. I scanned the columns of numbers, the lists of stocks and bonds. I'm no financial expert, but I know what a long string of zeros means. The figures were staggering, nonsensical. It was a fortune. A fortune Robert had never once mentioned. We had lived a comfortable life, yes. Robert had been a successful engineer, a man who believed in saving, in careful planning, in the quiet dignity of living below your means. We had our house, the cottage, 2 sensible cars, and enough to travel a little. I had thought I knew the full topography of our shared world. But this was another continent, a hidden empire I had never known existed. And at the very bottom of the pile, there was one last item. A single, smaller envelope of fine, cream-colored stationery. My name was written on the front in Robert's familiar, strong hand. My Annie. This was the key. The Rosetta Stone to this baffling new reality. I slid my finger under the flap and pulled out a single folded sheet. The letter was dated the same day he had given me the envelope, his last coherent day. As I unfolded it, the scent of his desk, that old, comforting smell of paper and cedar seemed to rise from the page. My dearest Annie, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I can only hope that you have given yourself the time I asked for. The time to grieve for us. I know your heart, and I know you will have felt my loss like the loss of a limb. I am so sorry to have left you to face this world alone. That was never my plan. This, Annie, is my real plan. The one I have been working on for over 30 years. You are holding the truth of our life's work. I know you are confused, and probably a little angry that I kept this from you. Please, forgive me. This was never about secrecy for its own sake. It was about protection. For you. And, in its own way, for Angela. I started investing quietly back in the 80s, small risks that paid off. I found I had a knack for it. It became a kind of game, a private challenge. But as the portfolio grew, I realized what it truly was, a fortress. A way to ensure that no matter what happened to me, you would be safe. Truly safe. Not just comfortable, not just getting by, but secure in a way that no one could ever touch. I didn't tell you because I never wanted to change the life we had. It was a good life, a real one. I never wanted you to worry about market fluctuations, and I never wanted us to become the kind of people who measure their worth in dollars. And I didn't tell Angela because I saw, long before you were willing to admit it, the direction her compass was turning. I love our daughter more than words can say, Annie. But I saw how easily she was swayed by the shiny and the new. I saw how much she craved the appearance of success. And I saw the man she chose to marry. Ethan is not a builder, he is a spender. A man who thinks debt is just a stepping stone to someone else's money. To give them this wealth outright would have been to destroy her. It would have fed the worst parts of her nature and starved the best. I hoped she would grow out of it, that she would find her own footing. But I couldn't risk your future on that hope, so I built this. Parker Holdings LLC is a legal entity, and upon my death, you Ann Parker, are its sole officer and sole beneficiary. Everything is yours. The properties, the stocks, all of it. Our attorney, George Miller, has all the corresponding paperwork. He has been my confidant in this for years. He is a good man. Trust him. Live well, my love. Travel. Be outrageously generous to strangers. Spoil yourself. Do all the things we talked about doing someday. This is your someday, this is your life, unburdened. It is my final gift to you. There is one last thing you should know. One of the properties I acquired years ago is the building on Commonwealth Avenue in the Back Bay. Yes, that one. Angela's building. I bought it as a silent investment. She pays her rent to a management company that reports to me now, to you. She has no idea. Use this knowledge as you see fit. You have a kinder heart than I do, Annie, but you also have a spine of steel. You just forget it's there sometimes. Don't let anyone, not even our daughter, make you feel small or helpless again. This is yours, defend it. All my love, for all time. Robert. I read the letter once, then twice, my vision blurring through a fresh wave of tears. These weren't tears of grief. They were tears of overwhelming, heartbreaking love. He had seen it all. He had seen Angela's trajectory, he had seen my vulnerability, and he had spent his life quietly building a shield around me. He had not just left me a legacy, he had left me a suit of armor. The rage from the clinic returned, but it was different now. It was no longer the hot, helpless anger of a victim. It was a cold, clear, focused fury. My daughter and her parasitic husband were in Europe, celebrating the pittance they'd gleaned from selling their father's memory, believing they had outsmarted a frail old woman. They were toasting their cleverness in a city somewhere, while the entire time, they were living in a gilded cage, and I, the woman they had just discarded, held the only key. I picked up the deed again, the one for the building in the Back Bay. There it was in stark black ink, 1247 Commonwealth Avenue. Angela's address. The luxury apartment with the concierge and the rooftop terrace she was so proud of. The home she lorded over me, with its sleek, impersonal furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine, a place where I always felt like a visitor, a relic from a less sophisticated time. She lived there, breathing my air, walking on my floors, sleeping under my roof, and she had no clue. The bitter, staggering irony of it was almost too much to bear. She had sold my little Cape cottage, my sanctuary of memories, for a fraction of its worth, while living in a multi-million-dollar building that belonged to me. She had sold Robert's Mustang, his passion project, the embodiment of his joy, for what was probably a few $1,000s, while the dividends from his stock portfolio could buy a fleet of them every month. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, that it transcended mere emotion. It became a fact. A law of physics in my new universe. Angela did not see me as her mother. She saw me as a resource to be managed, and now, to be liquidated. I carefully folded Robert's letter and placed it back in its small envelope. Then, with a newfound sense of order, I gathered the deeds and the statements. I stacked them into a neat, powerful pile. This wasn't just paper. It was power. It was security. It was justice, waiting to be served. I stood up from the bed and walked back into Robert's study. I ran my hand over the smooth, cool surface of his old wooden desk. He hadn't left me. He had armed me. He had trusted me to know what to do when the time came. And the time had come. Angela was on a plane, flying away from the mess she'd made, confident in her victory. But she wasn't flying toward a new life. She was flying into a cage of her own making. And the door was about to swing shut. I sat at Robert's desk for a long time, the fortress of paper he'd built for me stacked neatly to one side. The initial shock, that dizzying, heart-stopping plunge into a new reality, was beginning to subside. In its place, something cold and heavy was settling in my bones. It was the weight of the armor he had left me. It was formidable, yes, but it was also a burden. He had seen the war coming, and now I, the unwitting pacifist, had to learn how to fight it. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the wall of his study in strokes of pale gold and long, deep shadows. The house was quiet, a tomb of secrets. I felt a profound, aching loneliness, not for the man I had lost, but for the woman I used to be. The naive, trusting woman who believed in the fundamental goodness of her own child. That woman was gone. Angela had murdered her with a single phone call. Just as that thought crossed my mind, my phone, lying forgotten on the desk blotter, chimed with the sterile, electronic tone of a bank notification. I glanced at the screen. A text message from Angela. Sent you a little something to help out. Should be in your account now. Have a safe flight. Jew. My blood ran cold. Have a safe flight? The casual cruelty, the dismissive sign-off as if she were a distant acquaintance, was breathtaking. Beneath her text was the automated alert from my bank. You have received a direct deposit of $150,000 from Angela West. I stared at the number. $150,000. For a moment, the figure was just an abstraction, a string of zeros on a glowing screen. Then, the context crashed down on me with the force of a physical blow. This was my share. My consolation prize. This was what she had deemed a fair price for the sum of my memories, for the tangible pieces of the life Robert and I had built. I did the math in my head, my mind suddenly sharp and clear, a calculator clicking through the insult. The Cape Cottage, even in a down market, was worth $500,000. Easily. It was waterfront property, small but perfectly situated, the kind of legacy property Boston families held onto for generations. We'd had it appraised for insurance purposes just 2 years ago. The number had been $550,000. And the Mustang, a fully restored 1967 V8 Mustang, was a collector's item. Robert had turned down an offer of $70,000 for it at a car show the summer before he got sick. He'd just laughed and patted the hood. Can't put a price on this old girl, he'd said. So, let's be conservative. A combined value of at least $600,000. And she had sent me $150,000. Not even 30%. A token. A pittance designed not to be fair, but to be just enough to shut me up. Just enough for her to tell herself she had done the right thing, that she had helped out her poor, aging mother. The condescension was the worst part. The breezy, dismissive text. The lie embedded in the very number itself. She must have sold them in a hurry, probably to the first lowball cash offer that came along, desperate to get the money and run before I could interfere. She hadn't even tried to get fair market value. Why would she? It wasn't her money she was losing, it was mine. She was sacrificing tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars of my assets for the sake of her own convenience. I thought of the buyer of my cottage. Some stranger, walking through the rooms where Angela took her first steps, sleeping in the bedroom where Robert and I had listened to the waves for 40 years. I thought of the Mustang, probably already in the hands of some reseller who would flip it for twice what he paid Angela. She hadn't just sold my property, she had given it away. She had treated Robert's legacy like a yard sale, pricing everything to move. And then, a new notification lit up the screen. This one wasn't from my bank. It was from a social media app, one Angela had insisted I install so I could see pictures of her life. A life I was clearly not invited to participate in, only to observe from a safe, digital distance. There she was, a new post. A picture of her and Ethan, beaming, standing in front of an airport departure screen. He had his arm slung around her shoulder, a possessive, triumphant look on his face. She was holding up 2 glasses of champagne, her smile wide and brilliantly white. They looked happy, carefree, victorious. The caption was the final, twisting turn of the knife. Off to our next great adventure, big things happening in Europe. Time to finally live the life we've worked so hard for. Number, blessed number, Eurotrip number, making moves. The life we've worked so hard for. I almost laughed. A bitter, ugly sound tore from my throat. Their hard work. The hard work of liquidating a grieving mother's assets behind her back. The hard work of leveraging a father's memory for a cash advance. This wasn't the fruit of their labor. This was a heist, and they were posting pictures from the getaway car. I zoomed in on the photo, my own morbid curiosity compelling me. I saw the designer luggage at their feet. The expensive watch on Ethan's wrist. The perfectly manicured nails on Angela's hand, the one holding the champagne flute, a hand that had just signed away my history. They were performing their success, broadcasting it for the world to see, and the price of admission had been my heart. The rage I felt was so pure, so absolute, it was almost calming. It burned away the last vestiges of grief and confusion. There was no room for sorrow anymore. Robert's letter and Angela's Instagram post were two sides of the same coin. One was a testament to love, foresight, and protection. The other was a monument to greed, deceit, and breathtaking selfishness. I looked from the picture on my phone to the stack of documents on the desk. She was celebrating a victory in a game she didn't even know she was playing. She thought she held the winning hand, a fistful of cash. She had no idea that I was holding the entire deck. The casino. The block the casino was built on. This money she'd sent me, this insulting pittance, it wasn't a settlement. It was evidence. It was an admission of guilt, gift wrapped in condescension. The illegal sale of the cottage, the unauthorized transfer of the Mustang's title, it was all a crime. A messy, desperate, foolish crime. And I had the wire transfer, the text message, and the public social media post to prove it. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening street. A neighbor was walking his dog, the picture of quiet, suburban normalcy. My life had been like that this morning. Now, it was a battleground. Angela and Ethan were in the air, suspended 30,000 feet above the earth, sipping champagne and dreaming of the European empire they would build with my money. They felt untouchable, free. She was wrong. They weren't flying toward freedom. They were flying into a meticulously constructed trap, laid 30 years ago by a man who loved them, but who saw them with unflinching clarity. Robert had built a fortress to protect me. But a fortress can also be a prison. I turned back to the desk. The name on Robert's letter seemed to glow in the dimming light. George Miller, attorney at law. I picked up the phone. My thumb hovered over the numbers. It was late, well past business hours. But I had a feeling George Miller was the kind of man who would take the call. Robert had trusted him. He had called him a good man. And right now, I needed a good man. I needed a strategist. I needed an ally. My anger had cooled, solidifying into something harder, more durable. Resolve. Angela wanted to play the game of high finance, of making moves. She was about to find out what it was like to play against someone who owned the board. She thought she had taken my past. She had no idea I now controlled her future. I pressed the numbers to dial. The game was on. My finger hovered over the last digit of George Miller's phone number. The house was a cavern of shadows around me, the only light the cold, accusatory glow of my phone screen. This was the point of no return. The moment I pressed this last number, the quiet, grieving life of Ann Parker would be over. A new woman would be born in its place, one forged in the crucible of my daughter's betrayal. I took one last, steadying breath and pressed the screen. The phone rang, each electronic pulse a beat of a war drum. It was nearly 7 o'clock in the evening. I expected a voicemail, a polite, recorded message from a man who had long since gone home to his family. Instead, on the third ring, a calm, deep voice answered. George Miller. There was no preamble, no questioning the late hour. Just a simple statement of fact. He was there. He was present. In that moment, I understood why Robert had trusted him. My own voice, when it came, was steadier than I had a right to expect. Mr. Miller. My name is Ann Parker. Robert Parker's wife. The silence on the other end was brief, but it was filled with a respectful weight. "Mrs. Parker," he said, his tone softening with a genuine warmth that caught me off guard. "I'm so sorry. I've been meaning to call. I wanted to give you your space, but please accept my deepest condolences. Your husband was a remarkable man. One of the finest I've ever known." The sincerity in his voice was a balm, but it was also a sharp reminder of the battle ahead. "Thank you, Mr. Miller. He spoke very highly of you as well. In fact, he left me a letter. He said you were his confidant. He said I should trust you." Another pause. This one was different. It was the sound of a professional mind shifting gears, moving from sympathy to attention. "A letter," he stated, not a question. "Yes," I said. "And an envelope full of documents. Deeds. Brokerage statements. Something called Parker Holdings LLC. I let the name hang in the air between us. "I see," George said, his voice now devoid of any personal warmth, replaced by a focused, professional quiet. "Mrs. Parker, are you in a secure location? Can you speak freely?" "I'm at home. I'm alone." "Very good." Robert was meticulous. He established the LLC over 30 years ago. He was a brilliant, patient investor. And to be clear, his instructions in his final trust were ironclad. Upon his passing, sole ownership and control of all assets held by Parker Holdings LLC transferred directly and immediately to you. You are the only officer, the only beneficiary. It is, for all legal intents and purposes, entirely yours. He delivered the words with the dispassionate clarity of a surgeon describing an X-ray. He was confirming the impossible, making Robert's secret fortress real and tangible. My hand tightened on the receiver. "I understand, Mr. Miller, the reason I'm calling, something has happened. My daughter, Angela." I took a breath, forcing the words out, laying the ugly facts bare. "She informed me today that she has sold my cottage on the Cape, and my husband's car, a 1967 Mustang. She did this without my knowledge or consent. A few moments ago, she wired me what she considers to be my share, a fraction of their actual value. She and her husband are, as we speak, on a flight to Europe." The silence that followed was profound. I could picture him at his desk, a man of order and law, processing a story of such naked, familial treachery. When he finally spoke, the calm in his voice had been replaced by a sub-zero chill. "She did what?" "She sold them," I repeated, my voice flat. "She said she was taking care of loose ends." "Mrs. Parker, Anne, may I call you Anne?" "Yes. Anne, your name and your name alone was on the deed to that cottage, correct? Robert transferred it solely to you years ago as part of his estate planning." "That's correct. And the Mustang was specifically named in his will as a direct bequest to you." "Yes." He let out a long, slow breath. It was a sound of profound disgust. "Then what your daughter has done is not a loose end. It's a felony, several, in fact. Forgery, wire fraud, theft by conversion. The list is extensive. She would have had to forge your signature on the transfer of title for both assets. In the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that is a serious, serious crime." He paused. "The sale of the cottage is completely fraudulent. It is immediately and unequivocally voidable. We can start proceedings to have it reversed tomorrow morning." Voidable. The word was a lifeboat. The image of the stranger in my home began to recede. But his other words, felony, fraud, jail, they hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I thought of Angela, my little girl with the scraped knees and the gap-toothed grin. I thought of her in a courtroom. In a headline. In a prison cell. My heart, the foolish, stubborn heart of a mother, ached with a pain that was entirely separate from my anger. Robert had seen this coming. He had known she was capable of this. And he had built this fortress to protect me, not to destroy her. "Anne, are you still there?" George's voice was gentle now, pulling me back from the precipice. "The first thing we need to do is file a police report and notify the district attorney. We need to freeze her accounts before she can spend the rest of that money. This was the path of righteous, legal fury. The path of justice. It was the path he was laying out for me, the one any sane, wronged person would take. But as I looked at the pile of documents on Robert's desk, at the evidence of his patient, 30-year plan, I knew it wasn't my path. Robert didn't build a fortress so I could lob grenades from the walls. He built it so I wouldn't have to. No, I said, the word coming out with a quiet finality that surprised even me. No? George sounded genuinely confused. Anne, she has stolen from you. She has committed a serious crime. I know what she's done, I said, my voice gaining strength, and I know what the law says. But I don't want a scandal, George. I don't want a trial. I don't want to see my daughter's picture in the newspaper. That isn't justice, that's just a mess. It's a spectacle. I could hear the rustle of papers on his end, the clicking of a pen. He was listening. He was trying to understand. What I want, I continued, the plan forming in my mind, as clear and sharp as a shard of glass, is a lesson. Robert wrote in his letter that giving Angela this wealth would have destroyed her. And he was right. So she needs to learn what it means to lose everything. Not in a courtroom, not in public. But quietly, privately. She needs to come home from her grand European adventure to nothing. She needs to feel the full, crushing weight of her own choices. I explained it all to him then. The final piece of Robert's letter. The fact that Angela was living in my building. The fact that she was a tenant, paying rent to a holding company that I now controlled. The line went silent for a very long time. I began to wonder if he thought I had lost my mind, if my grief had curdled into some strange, elaborate revenge fantasy. But when George Miller finally spoke, his voice was filled with a new sound. It was a sound of profound, almost reverent, respect. My God, he whispered. He really did think of everything. He paused, and then his voice became firm, the ally I so desperately needed. All right, Anne. No police, no district attorney. Not yet, anyway. We'll hold that option in reserve. A loaded gun on the table that they don't even know is there. We do this your way. Quietly. Methodically. We will gut them without them ever hearing us coming. A wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled my knees washed over me. I wasn't alone in this anymore. So, what's the first move? I asked, feeling for the first time like a general, not a victim. The first move, George said, his voice now crisp and energized, is reclamation. We start the process of voiding the cottage sale immediately. I'll contact the buyer's attorney tomorrow. We'll make it clear the sale was fraudulent and give them a choice, return the property, or become a party to a criminal investigation. They'll fold. We'll get the house back. For the Mustang, I'll hire a private investigator to track the VIN. We'll find out who bought it and persuade them to sell it back. Discretion is expensive, but it's a price worth paying. While that's happening, I will begin transferring full, direct control of every asset in Parker Holdings from the LLC to you, personally. We will sever every tie Angela and Ethan have to your financial world, including their tenancy at 1247 Commonwealth Avenue. Gone. He laid it all out, a quiet, devastating campaign of bureaucratic warfare. Each step was a silent, invisible tightening of a noose. They will come home to a world they no longer control, I said, finishing his thought. They will come home, George corrected gently, to a world that is exactly as it should have been all along. Yours. We spoke for a few more minutes, arranging a meeting for the following day. When I hung up the phone, the house was completely dark, but it was no longer menacing. The shadows were no longer filled with grief, but with patience. I had declined to press charges. I had refused the public spectacle of a trial. Because I finally understood. The most devastating punishments aren't the ones that are shouted from the rooftops, they are the ones that are delivered in silence. The ones that leave the recipient utterly and completely alone with the wreckage they created. Angela wanted a life of glamour and ease, bought with my past. I was about to give her a future built on the one thing she had never learned: consequences. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. On the surface, nothing changed. I was still Ann Parker, the quiet widow in the small house in Jamaica Plain. I tended Robert's garden, the late summer roses blooming in a riot of defiant color. I exchanged pleasantries with my neighbors over the fence, discussing the weather and the rising price of groceries. I played the part of a woman winding down, a life lived in soft focus. But beneath that placid surface, a war was being waged. It was a war fought not with angry phone calls or tearful confrontations, but with the silent, relentless machinery of the law. My days were a study in contrasts. Mornings were spent in George Miller's quiet, wood-paneled office, a world of affidavits, wire transfer receipts, and notarized documents. Afternoons were spent back in my own world, my hands in the dirt, pruning back the dead wood from the rose bushes. The symbolism was not lost on me. George moved with the quiet efficiency of a master strategist. The reclamation of the cottage was the first and most critical battle. He didn't storm in with threats. Instead, he made a single, polite phone call to the attorney who had handled the purchase. He laid out the facts with surgical precision. The sale was based on a forged signature, making it unequivocally fraudulent. He presented two options. Option A: the buyer could voluntarily nullify the sale, be refunded their full purchase price, and walk away quietly. Option B: they could refuse, at which point we would file a criminal complaint, and the property would become evidence in a grand larceny investigation that would tie it up in court for years. It took less than 24 hours for them to choose option A. They were an investment firm, George discovered, bottom feeders who specialized in quick cash purchases from the desperate or the naive. They had no interest in a protracted legal battle or criminal exposure. They had gambled on an easy flip and lost. A week later, a courier delivered a thick envelope to George's office containing the signed documents that reversed the sale. The cottage was mine again, just like that. There was no fanfare, just the quiet, satisfying scratch of a pen on a legal form. I held the new deed in my hands, my name printed in crisp, black ink. It felt less like a victory and more like a correction setting a fractured bone back into its proper place. The Mustang was a more delicate operation. George hired the private investigator he'd mentioned, a discreet man named Fitzpatrick who looked more like a history professor than a detective. He tracked the car's vehicle identification number with an almost casual ease. Angela, in her haste, had sold it to a high-volume used luxury car dealer on the outskirts of the city. The dealer, smelling a desperate seller, had paid her a criminally low price $30,000, less than half its worth, and had it listed on his website for $85,000. Fitzpatrick didn't approach the dealer with accusations. He approached him as a buyer. He called himself a representative for a private car collector in Connecticut who had been searching for that specific year and model. He negotiated a price, $75,000, and arranged a discreet buyback. The money, drawn from one of the Parker Holdings accounts I now controlled, felt like a ransom paid for a hostage. 2 weeks after Angela's flight to Europe, a flatbed truck delivered the Mustang to a secure storage facility George had rented. I went to see it that afternoon. Standing in the cool, concrete silence of the garage, I ran my hand along the Mustang's polished midnight blue fender. It was exactly as I remembered. The faint scent of Robert's pipe tobacco still clung to the leather interior. Fitzpatrick had even recovered the old pair of his driving gloves from the glove compartment. Sitting in the driver's seat, my hands on the smooth, wooden steering wheel, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt a profound, hollow sadness. Robert had poured his heart into this machine. Angela had sold it for pocket money. I had just bought it back with the fortune he had hidden to protect me from her. The circular, tragic nature of it all was dizzying. While the cottage and the car were being recovered, George was meticulously untangling and reweaving the web of Robert's finances. He worked like a master weaver at a loom, shifting control of every stock, every bond, every real estate holding from the anonymous shield of the LLC directly to me, Ann Parker. My signature was now required for any transaction, no matter how small. The accounts Angela had once been able to manipulate through the forged power of attorney were now ironclad vaults to which she had no key. We closed the old bank accounts and opened new ones at a different institution, cutting off any lingering access she might have had. The final, most significant move was transferring the direct ownership of the Back Bay apartment building. George dissolved the intermediary management company it was held under and placed the property deed squarely in my name. He then drew up new administrative paperwork for the building's tenants. Among them was a formal notice of lease review for the resident of Penthouse B, Miss Angela West. It wasn't an eviction notice, not yet. It was something quieter, more bureaucratic, and therefore, more terrifying. It was a simple, formal letter stating that the building was under new ownership and that all leases would be reviewed in 30 days, with no guarantee of renewal. The letter would be waiting for her upon her return. Through all of this, my life in Jamaica Plain remained a carefully curated performance of impoverished widowhood. I drove my old, sensible sedan. I clipped coupons. I spoke to my neighbor, Nora, about my concerns over the rising heating oil prices for the coming winter. Nora was a kind woman, a retired nurse with sharp, observant eyes. She would often bring over a small casserole or a plate of cookies, her gestures of sympathy both genuine and, I suspected, a little bit probing. "It must be so hard for you, Anne, rattling around in this big house all alone," she said one afternoon as we stood by the fence. "And with Angela so far away, you're lucky she has that successful husband to take care of her." Quote. I just smiled, a sad, knowing smile that I was becoming frighteningly good at. "Yes, Ethan is very ambitious," I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I just hope they're being careful." The lie felt slick and easy, and I hated myself for it. But it was necessary. My power, for now, was in being underestimated. It was in being the woman everyone felt sorry for. Angela and Ethan were counting on that. They had built their entire European fantasy on the foundation of my perceived weakness. They were posting photos from Rome, from Paris, from the Amalfi Coast, pictures of expensive dinners, boutique hotels, and designer shopping bags. "Living our best life," one caption read. They were burning through the money from the cottage and the Mustang at a ferocious rate, a bonfire of my memories to warm their lavish vacation. I watched their digital trail of breadcrumbs, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of detached, clinical interest. They were like characters in a play, moving toward a final act they couldn't see. They had no idea that while they were posing for selfies in front of the Colosseum, the locks on their world were being quietly, systematically changed. One evening, I sat at Robert's desk, a single lamp casting a warm pool of light on a stack of new, finalized documents. The deed to the cottage, the title to the Mustang, the updated portfolio statements, now bearing only my name. The entire reclamation was complete. Robert's fortress was secure. I looked at the photograph of him I kept on the corner of the desk. He was younger in the picture, his smile easy and confident, his eyes full of the quiet intelligence I had loved so much. "I'm trying, Robert," I whispered into the silent room. "I'm trying to be the woman with the spine of steel." He had left me the tools and the strategy, but it was up to me to see the battle through. Angela and Ethan were living a fantasy life in Europe, a life funded by theft and deceit. But fantasies, by their very nature, have to end. Reality has a way of reasserting itself, often at the most inconvenient of times. Their cash was running out. Their trip would soon be over, and they would come home, expecting to walk back into the life they had left behind. They would come home to find a world that no longer recognized them. They would knock on doors that would not open. And they would finally, for the first time in their cosseted lives, have to face the one thing they had never been taught how to handle: themselves. The first sign that the fantasy was cracking came not as a roar, but as a whisper. It arrived in the form of a discreet email to George Miller from Fitzpatrick, the private investigator. He had, at George's quiet instruction, continued to maintain a light, passive surveillance on Ethan's financial background. It was a loose thread George had wanted to tug, a hunch based on Robert's long-held distrust. The hunch had paid off. "You should see this, Anne," George said, his voice flat and business-like over the phone. He forwarded the email. I opened it, my heart a slow, heavy drum. It was a concise report, stripped of all emotion, a simple recitation of facts. And the facts were devastating. Ethan wasn't just a spendthrift, he was a con man in a tailor-made suit. The big deal in Europe was a complete fabrication. There was no company, no contract, no opportunity. There was only debt. A mountain of it. He owed money to private lenders in 3 different states, the kind of lenders who don't send polite reminder notices. He had a string of failed businesses, each one funded by a new set of investors he'd charmed and subsequently ghosted. The trip to Europe wasn't a business venture, it was an escape. He was running. And he had used my money, the money from the sale of my home and Robert's legacy, as the fuel for his getaway car, with my daughter riding shotgun, blissfully, willfully ignorant. The report also contained a chilling detail. Ethan had a history. He had married once before, a wealthy woman in her late 50s. The marriage had lasted less than a year, just long enough for him to drain her accounts and disappear. The patterns were identical. The charm offensive, the promises of a brilliant future, the slow, methodical siphoning of funds, and the final, abrupt departure. He wasn't just a bad husband, he was a predator. I stared at the screen, the words blurring. I had seen Ethan as shallow, as a bad influence, as a man unworthy of my daughter. I had never imagined this. This was a different level of darkness. And Angela, my brilliant, beautiful Angela, had walked straight into it. Had she been his accomplice? Or was she just another mark? Looking back at their Instagram posts, the performative joy, the desperate flaunting of wealth, I realized the truth was likely a toxic mix of both. She was so desperate to believe in the fantasy he was selling that she had become his co-conspirator in her own destruction. 2 weeks after that email, the digital breadcrumb trail went cold. The stream of cheerful, sun-drenched photos from Europe stopped abruptly. The last one was from a 5-star hotel in Monaco. After that, silence. I imagined the final, ugly scene. The moment the money ran out. The moment the charm evaporated and the mask came off, revealing the cold, empty void beneath. The moment he told her the truth, or more likely, the moment he simply disappeared, leaving her alone in an expensive hotel room with a bill she couldn't pay. Another week passed in that heavy, waiting silence. I went about my days, the knowledge of Angela's impending return a stone in my gut. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. I just felt a deep, weary sadness. The lesson I had intended to teach her about consequences, about respect, was about to be delivered, but in a much harsher, more brutal way than I had ever intended. I had wanted to force her to stand on her own 2 feet. I had never wanted to watch her be cut off at the knees. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. It was raining, a cold, miserable Boston drizzle that matched the mood in my heart. The caller ID was a number I didn't recognize, a local area code. I answered. "Hello? Mom?" The voice was small, cracked, and fragile. It was the voice of a child who had fallen and scraped her knee, a voice I hadn't heard in 20 years. All the anger, all the carefully constructed walls of my resolve, crumbled in that single word. "Angela? Where are you?" I'm at Logan Airport," she sobbed, the sound raw and broken. "Mom, he's gone. Ethan's gone. He left me. He took everything. My passport, the last of the cash. I had to go to the embassy. They gave me an emergency travel document to get home. Mom, I don't have anything." I closed my eyes, picturing her standing there alone amidst the chaos of the international arrivals terminal. Not the glamorous, champagne-toasting woman from the Instagram photo, but a lost, terrified girl. "I'm coming to get you," I said, my voice thick. "Stay right where you are, I'll be there in 30 minutes. I didn't ask questions. I didn't say "I told you so." The time for that would come. Right now, in that moment, she wasn't the architect of my betrayal. She was just my daughter, and she was in trouble. The ancient, stubborn instinct of a mother took over. When I pulled up to the curb at Terminal E, I barely recognized her. She was haggard, her face pale and tear-streaked beneath the fluorescent airport lights. Her expensive clothes were rumpled, her hair a mess. She was clutching a single, small carry-on bag. The mountain of designer luggage was gone. She looked small, defeated. She climbed into the passenger seat without a word and burst into a fresh storm of tears. I drove home in silence, the only sound in the car the rhythmic slap of the windshield wipers and her ragged, heartbroken sobs. She didn't speak, and I didn't press her. The whole story was written on her face. The story of a dream that had turned into a nightmare. When we pulled into my driveway in Jamaica Plain, she looked at my small, familiar house as if she'd never seen it before. It was a port in a storm, the only solid ground in her collapsed world. Inside, I made her a cup of tea, my hands moving with an old, familiar rhythm. She sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd done her homework as a child, and stared into the rising steam, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. "The apartment," she finally whispered, her voice hoarse. I tried my keys. They didn't work. The concierge, he wouldn't let me up. He said he didn't recognize me. What's happening? The moment had arrived. The quiet, bureaucratic blade I had set in place weeks ago was about to fall. I kept my voice gentle, but I didn't soften the truth. "The building was sold, Angela. It's under new ownership." She looked up at me, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning horror. "Sold? To who?" "They can't just kick me out. We have a lease. The new owners are reviewing all the leases," I said, quoting the letter I knew she had yet to see. "There's no guarantee of renewal. But all my things are in there. My clothes, my furniture, my whole life is in that apartment." The panic was rising in her voice, a thin, shrill note of hysteria. She was a queen who had just returned to her castle to find the gates barred and her name stricken from the records. As if on cue, there was a soft knock at the front door. I knew who it was. George had arranged it. A final, perfectly timed piece of the mechanism. I went to the door. A professional process server, a man in a nondescript coat, stood on my porch, holding a crisp, white envelope. He politely asked if I was Ann Parker. I said I was. He then asked if Angela West was present. I nodded and called her to the door. "Angela West?" he asked, his voice impersonal. Angela just stared at him, bewildered. "Yes? You've been served," he said, handing her the envelope. He turned and walked away without another word. Her hands trembled as she tore it open. She pulled out the single sheet of paper. Her eyes scanned the legal text, her face draining of all color. I didn't need to read it. I knew what it said. It was a formal, 30-day eviction notice, served on behalf of the building's new owner, Parker Holdings LLC. She looked from the paper to my face, her eyes filled with a wild, desperate confusion. The two pieces of the puzzle, her locked apartment and this piece of paper, were floating in her mind, unable to connect. She didn't understand. She couldn't. The truth was too monstrous, too impossible for her to comprehend. "Parker Holdings," she whispered, the name a foreign sound on her tongue. "Who is that? What does this mean?" She was standing on the precipice, the solid ground of her life having crumbled away into nothingness. No husband, no money, no home. She had flown halfway around the world, only to find herself a complete and utter stranger in her own life. She had come home, and there was nothing left. She stood in the doorway, the rain dripping from the hem of her expensive, now rumpled coat, creating a small, dark puddle on my welcome mat. The eviction notice was clutched in her hand, the paper limp and creased from the force of her grip. Her face, a mask of bewildered horror, was turned to mine, her eyes searching for an answer to a question she didn't even know how to ask. The name on the paper, Parker Holdings LLC, was a ghost, a meaningless string of words in the spectacular wreckage of her life. I stepped back, holding the door open wider. "Come in, Angela, you're getting soaked." My voice was quiet, devoid of accusation or triumph. It was the voice I used when she was a child and had fallen from her bike, calm, practical, focused on the immediate need. She stumbled inside, drawn by the simple offering of shelter. I closed the door, shutting out the cold, weeping sky. The silence of the house enveloped us, a thick, heavy blanket. We ended up back at the kitchen table, the scene of so many of life's small negotiations and confessions. The eviction notice lay between us, stark and white against the warm oak of the tabletop. It felt like a declaration of war from an unknown enemy, and she had come to the one person she thought was a neutral territory, a safe haven, never suspecting she was sitting in the enemy's command tent. She stared at the paper, her finger tracing the unfamiliar corporate name. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice a raw thread. "Who are they? Why would they? How could they just?" The words trailed off, her mind unable to build a bridge across the chasm of her ignorance. She looked up at me, her eyes pleading. "Did you know about this? Did they contact you?" This was the first test. The moment where I could have revealed everything, could have laid Robert's entire secret empire at her feet and watched her shatter completely. But that would have been a spectacle. My plan was built on strategy. The lesson had to be absorbed, not just witnessed. I chose my words with the care of a pharmacist measuring poison. "I knew the building was sold," I said, offering a sliver of the truth. "These things happen. Buildings change hands." My calmness seemed to agitate her more than anger would have. She was drowning, and I was describing the temperature of the water. "But, without warning? They can't just throw me out. Everything I own is in there." The hysteria was bubbling up again, the raw panic of a person who has lost their footing entirely. And then, as if a dam inside her finally broke, the smaller, immediate crisis of the apartment gave way to the larger, catastrophic truth of her situation. "He's gone, Mom," she choked out, the words tumbling over each other in a torrent of grief and humiliation. "Ethan, he just left. We were in Monaco. One minute we were having dinner, and the next, he was gone. He'd checked out of the hotel, he took the last of the money. He even took my passport. He just vanished. Gone." I listened, my face a carefully composed mask of maternal concern. I let her talk, letting the poison drain out. The story she told was a sordid, pathetic tale, a world away from the glamorous fiction she had been posting online. The big deal in Europe had been a series of vague, ever-postponed meetings. The money, my money, had been hemorrhaging on five-star hotels, $1,000 dinners, and designer boutiques. She spoke of Ethan's mounting anxiety, the hushed, angry phone calls he would take in another room, the way his charm had begun to feel brittle, stretched thin. "He said it was investor trouble," she sobbed, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "He said they were getting cold feet, that he just needed a little more time. A little more cash to grease the wheels." I believed him. God, I was so stupid. I believed every word. I remained silent, letting her confession hang in the air. I had to know how deep the rot went. Was this the lament of a co-conspirator, or the cry of a fool? "And the money from the cottage?" I asked, my voice soft. "What did he tell you about that?" She wouldn't meet my eyes. She stared at her hands, twisting a napkin into a shredded mess. "He said it was seed money. A short-term loan to ourselves to secure the financing. He said we'd pay you back, double, once the deal closed. He made it sound so smart, so practical. He said you'd want us to be successful." There it was, the pathetic, self-serving justification. She hadn't been a criminal mastermind. She had been a willing, greedy accomplice, so blinded by the promise of a life she felt she deserved that she had happily sold her own mother's past to finance it. She wasn't evil, she was just weak, and in some ways, that was worse. And now, she whispered, her voice cracking, they're calling. The creditors. They're not the bank, Mom, they're scary. They called the hotel in Monaco. They knew where we were. That's why he ran. He didn't just leave me, he used me. He left me behind to face them. The full, ugly picture was finally complete. She had been his shield, his collateral. The last line of defense he could sacrifice while he made his own escape. The realization was a fresh wave of agony on her face. She wasn't just heartbroken, she had been used as a tool and then discarded. The humiliation was absolute. She finally looked up at me, her face stripped of all its usual confidence, all its practiced poise. It was the face of a child. Lost, terrified, and utterly broken. I have nothing, she said, the words a simple, stark admission. No money, no home. My keys don't work. My husband is gone. I don't know what to do. Mom, what am I going to do? She had reached the bottom. The hard, cold, unyielding bedrock of her own bad choices. And in that moment of absolute desperation, she had come back to the one place she had spent the last decade treating with casual disdain. She had come home. I let the silence sit for a long moment, letting her truly feel the weight of her question. I looked at my daughter, this stranger with a familiar face, and I felt a complex, warring mixture of emotions. There was the cold satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. There was the deep, resonant rightness of Robert's foresight. But beneath it all, a stubborn, ancient instinct stirred. The instinct to shelter my child from the storm, even a storm of her own making. This was the moment. The pivot point of my entire strategy. You can stay here, I said, my voice even and calm. She blinked, as if she hadn't heard me correctly. What? You can stay here, I repeated. Your old room is upstairs. It's just as you left it. The look on her face was a painful thing to watch. It was a torrent of warring emotions, overwhelming relief, crushing shame, and a dawning, horrified understanding of how completely the power dynamic between us had just been inverted. She, Angela West, the glamorous resident of the Back Bay penthouse, was being offered a bed in her childhood room like a teenager who had broken curfew. She could only nod, her throat working, unable to form words. I stood up. Come on, I said gently. Let's get you settled. Gwen. I led her out of the kitchen and up the familiar, creaking stairs. I pushed open the door to her old bedroom. The late afternoon light, gray and weak through the rain-streaked window, illuminated a room that was a perfect time capsule of a life she had long since abandoned. The faded pink wallpaper, the white canopy bed, the corkboard on the wall, still peppered with old photographs of high school friends and ticket stubs from concerts. A stuffed bear, a gift from Robert when she was 10, sat on the pillow, its button eyes staring out with a kind of silent, patient judgment. It was the room of a girl, full of naive dreams. It was the absolute antithesis of the cold, minimalist, steel and glass apartment she had lost. That apartment had been a stage set for the successful woman she pretended to be. This room was the undeniable truth of who she was now, a child, dependent once more on the mother she had tried to discard. She stood in the doorway, her small carry-on bag clutched in her hand, and surveyed the room. She was a ghost visiting her own past. Then, her shoulders slumped, the last of her fight draining out of her, and she began to cry again. Not the hysterical sobs from before, but a quiet, hopeless, exhausted weeping. I didn't comfort her. I didn't put my arm around her. I simply stood back and let her feel the full, crushing weight of it all. This was not an act of cruelty. It was a necessary part of the lesson. This offer, this room, it was an act of love, yes. On some fundamental, primal level, she was my daughter, and I could not see her on the street. But it was also an act of leverage. The purest form of it. She was now under my roof. She would eat my food. She would sleep in a bed that I provided. She had lost every ounce of her independence. The reckoning had just begun, and its classroom was her own childhood bedroom. She was home. But she was also, finally, and completely, mine to control. The days that followed were a quiet, suffocating ordeal. My house, once a sanctuary of solitude, became a silent battlefield of shame and unspoken truths. Angela was a ghost in her own past, haunting the hallways of a life she had gleefully discarded. She slept in her childhood bed, surrounded by the faded pink wallpaper and the ghosts of her teenage dreams, a prisoner in the museum of her own innocence. She spent most of her time in that room, the door closed. The only sounds were the muffled, frantic whispers of her phone calls. She was negotiating with the sharks Ethan had left in his wake. I could hear the cadence of it through the door, the pleading, the bargaining, the desperate, hollow promises. The creditors were not kind. They did not care that she, too, was a victim. In their world, she was not a casualty, she was collateral. I went about my routines, a careful performance of normalcy. I cooked meals she barely touched. I drank my morning coffee at the kitchen table, the silence across from me a screaming void. We were two strangers sharing a roof, bound by blood and the wreckage of her life. There was no warmth, no reconciliation. Every shared space was thick with the things we were not saying. She did not ask about the eviction, about the mysterious Parker Holdings LLC. She seemed too terrified to pull at that thread, instinctively knowing it would unravel the last of her sanity. And I did not offer any information. The lesson required her to sit in the rubble, to feel the sharp edges of every broken piece. One afternoon, about a week after her return, I came home from the grocery store to find her in the living room. It was the first time she had ventured out of her room for anything other than a meal. She was on the floor, the contents of her single, pathetic carry-on bag spread out around her. It was a sad collection of artifacts from her interrupted fantasy. A few designer scarves, a half-empty bottle of expensive perfume, a guidebook to the Amalfi Coast. It was the debris of a shipwreck. She was sorting through a small leather pouch, her movements listless, her face a blank mask of exhaustion. Then, her hand stilled. She pulled something out. It was another envelope, smaller than the one Robert had left for me, made of a thick, unfamiliar paper, sealed with a dark red wax seal that had been cracked open. I don't remember this, she said, her voice thin, as if she were talking to herself. She turned it over. Her own name, Angela, was written on the front in a hand she didn't recognize. I stood in the doorway, my grocery bags suddenly heavy in my hands. I said nothing. This was not my move to make. This was a message from the past, an echo from a man who had seen this day coming. Angela's brow furrowed. She pulled out the contents. It wasn't a letter. It was a single, heavy, old-fashioned key and a small, folded note. She unfolded the note. The handwriting was not Ethan's. It was strong, angular, and instantly recognizable. It was Robert's. She read the note aloud, her voice trembling, each word a discovery. Angela, it began, without greeting or affection. It was the voice of Robert the engineer, not Robert the father. If you are reading this, it means the man you chose has finally shown you who he is. It means the life you thought you were building was a house of cards, and a strong wind has finally come. I take no joy in this. You are my daughter, and your pain will always, on some level, be mine. But love, true love, is not blind. It sees the flaws, the weaknesses, the poor choices, and it hopes for better. I have watched you chase the wrong things your entire adult life. You mistake glitter for gold. You value appearance over substance. This key is a final test. It is not a reward, it is not a bailout. It is a lifeline, and it is up to you to decide if you will use it to pull yourself to shore, or if you will tie it around your ankle and sink faster. First Commonwealth Bank. Downtown Crossing. Box 247. Your name is on the access card alongside mine. What you find inside is your heritage. Use it wisely, or don't. The choice, like all the others, is yours." The note ended there, abrupt, unforgiving, loving, in its own brutal, clear-eyed way. He wasn't saving her. He was giving her one last chance to save herself. Angela stared at the note, then at the heavy, ornate brass key in her palm. A flicker of something I hadn't seen since her return sparked in her eyes. Hope. It was a desperate, hungry, dangerous kind of hope. It was the hope of a gambler who has lost everything and has just been handed one last chip. She looked at me, her eyes wild. "Dad, he knew? He knew this would happen?" "Your father," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "saw things very clearly." "This key," she said, her voice gaining a frantic energy. "The bank. We have to go. Now, Mom, this could be it. This could be the answer." The drive downtown was thick with a new kind of tension. The air in my sensible sedan crackled with her desperate anticipation. She was vibrating in the passenger seat, turning the heavy key over and over in her hands. She was already spending the money in her head. I could see it on her face. This wasn't a lesson to her, it was a miracle. A deus ex machina sent by her father to rescue her from the consequences of her own life. I remained silent, a chauffeur to her frantic hope. I knew what this was. Robert hadn't left her a solution. He had left her a choice. A terrible, revealing choice. The First Commonwealth Bank was an old institution, a temple of money with marble floors and soaring ceilings that whispered of old Boston wealth. The process of accessing the safe deposit vault was solemn, almost ceremonial. A polite, suited man led us into a secure room, checked our identification, and compared our signatures to the cards on file. There they were. Robert Parker, Angela West. He had set this up years ago. The attendant retrieved the box, a long, heavy, metal container, and placed it on a table in a small, private viewing room, the very picture of discretion. He gave us a polite nod and closed the door behind him, leaving us alone. The box had 2 locks. The bank attendant had used his key on one. The second one was for the heavy brass key Angela held in her trembling hand. She fumbled with it for a moment, her desperation making her clumsy. Finally, the key slid into the lock. She turned it. There was a solid, satisfying thunk as the tumblers aligned. She lifted the heavy lid. The contents were not what she expected. There was no neat stack of cash, no bearer bonds, no easily liquidated assets. The box was lined with dark blue velvet, and nestled within it was our family's history, glittering under the cold, unforgiving light of the viewing room. There was my mother's pearl necklace, the one my father had given her on their wedding day, luminous and heavy with the weight of a happy marriage. There was my grandmother's diamond engagement ring, a beautiful, old European cut that had survived a world war. There were Robert's grandfather's cufflinks and his solid gold pocket watch, the one he had carried on the boat from Ireland. Each piece was a story. Each gem was a memory. Beneath the jewelry, there was a thick, waterproof pouch. Inside were meticulously preserved documents. Old stock certificates from companies that had long since been absorbed into larger ones, the original deed to our house in Jamaica Plain, our marriage certificate, Angela's birth certificate. It was the bedrock of our family, the tangible proof of a life built with love, patience, and hard work. An appraiser's note, also in Robert's hand, was clipped to the pouch. It was recent, dated only a year before his death. The estimated value of the jewelry and the collectible certificates was just over $200,000. Angela stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. She saw the number from the appraisal. She saw the glitter of the diamonds and the gleam of the gold. But she didn't see the history. She didn't see the legacy. She saw a number. She saw an escape hatch. Her entire demeanor changed. The broken, weeping girl vanished, and in her place was the old Angela, the efficient, calculating woman who saw the world as a series of assets to be managed. "This is it," she breathed, her fingers hovering over the pearls, not with reverence, but with the acquisitive touch of a pawnbroker. "This is enough. This is more than enough to get those men off my back. We have to sell it. All of it. Today. She looked at me, her eyes bright with a feverish relief. She expected me to agree, to be her partner in this final, desperate act of liquidation. I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at her, and then at the open box of our family's past. No, I said. The word was a stone dropped into a still pond. The hopeful, frantic energy in the room vanished. What do you mean, no? She hissed, her voice sharp. Mom, don't you understand? This is our way out. Dad left this for us. For this reason, got. Your father, I said, my voice as cold and hard as the marble floor outside, left you a lifeline. Not a slush fund to pay off a con man's gambling debts. It's not a slush fund, it's survival, she insisted, her voice rising. Those men will not stop. This is the only way. Is it? I asked, leaning forward slightly. Or is it just the easiest way? The quickest way to make the noise stop so you don't have to think about why it started in the first place? I reached into the box and lifted out my mother's pearls. They were cool and heavy in my hand. This is your great-grandmother's legacy. She wore these on her 50th wedding anniversary. Robert's grandfather used this watch to time the birth of his first son. I looked her directly in the eye, and for the first time, she did not look away. She was trapped by the intensity of my gaze. This box contains our family's story, Angela. It is filled with the things that last, the things that have substance. And you want to burn it all down to pay for a fraud. You want to set your heritage on fire to cover the debts of a man who saw you as nothing more than an exit strategy. My words hung in the sterile air of the viewing room. She flinched as if I had slapped her. The truth of it, laid bare in that cold, quiet room, was more brutal than any of her creditors' threats. You don't burn a legacy to fix a mistake, I said, my voice dropping to a near whisper. You honor it, you learn from it. You use it as an anchor, not as kindling. She stared at me, her mouth slightly open, the frantic, calculating light in her eyes dimming, replaced by a dawning, horrified understanding. She was finally seeing the box not as a treasure chest, but as a mirror, and she did not like the reflection. I placed the pearls gently back in the box and closed the heavy lid. The sound of it clicking shut was a sound of finality. The choice was hers. But the terms, I realized, were mine. The drive back to Jamaica Plain was a journey through a frozen landscape. The furious, pleading energy that had propelled Angela to the bank had vanished, leaving a void in its place. She sat in the passenger seat, rigid and silent, staring out the window at the city flashing by. The city that had once been her kingdom was now just a collection of buildings she could no longer enter. The heavy, ornate key to the safe deposit box lay on the console between us, a useless, mocking relic of the miracle she had been so sure was coming. My words in that cold, sterile viewing room had done more than just deny her a quick fix. They had shattered the last of her delusions. She had arrived at the bank a desperate woman looking for a windfall. She had left a woman who had been forced to look in a mirror and see not a victim of circumstance, but the architect of her own ruin. The silence in the car wasn't just the absence of conversation, it was the sound of a life being recalibrated, of a soul being forced to reckon with the staggering weight of its own emptiness. When we got back to the house, she went straight upstairs to her room without a word. I didn't see her for the rest of the day. I didn't hear any more frantic phone calls. The house was utterly still, but the silence was different now. It was the quiet of a fever that has finally broken, leaving the patient weak, exhausted, but lucid for the first time. The next morning, she came down to the kitchen. She had been crying, her eyes were red-rimmed and puffy, but her face was set with a new, fragile determination. She sat down at the table and pushed a piece of paper across to me. It was a list. On it were the names of the most aggressive of Ethan's creditors, with the amounts owed scrawled next to them. I'm going to sell the jewelry, she said, her voice quiet, stripped of all its former arrogance. It was the voice of unconditional surrender. Not all of it. Not the pearls or the ring. Not the things that were, Theirs. She gestured vaguely, unable to say my mother's or grandmother's names. But the rest, the cufflinks, the watch, the other pieces. It should be enough to stop the worst of them. To make them go away. She was not asking for my permission. She was informing me of her decision. She was, for the first time, taking ownership of the mess. It was a small step, a desperate, reactive step, but it was a step forward nonetheless. I just nodded. All right. The process was a grim, humiliating affair. We didn't go to a high-end auction house or a discreet private dealer. Angela, using my old laptop, found a reputable but brutally unsentimental estate jeweler in the city who dealt in quick, private sales. It was a place designed for people who needed cash, not for people who wanted to honor their family's heirlooms. She handled the transaction herself. I drove her to the appointment, but I waited in the car. This was her humiliation, her burden to bear. I watched her through the window as she sat across from a man in a jeweler's loupe, my great-uncle's gold pocket watch held clinically in his gloved hands. She had to watch as he reduced a lifetime of stories and sentiment to a simple number on a check. She was gone for almost an hour. When she came back and slid into the passenger seat, she was pale, but her jaw was set. 180,000, she said, her voice flat. She held up the cashier's check, a flimsy piece of paper that represented the melted-down value of her heritage. It's enough, for now. That money was a tourniquet, not a cure. It stopped the immediate bleeding, placating the most dangerous of the loan sharks Ethan had entangled them with. She spent the next 2 days executing wire transfers, her face a grim mask of concentration as she watched the last of her father's lifeline drain away to men with menacing voices and no last names. When the final transfer was complete, she was left with nothing but the clothes on her back, her childhood bedroom, and a debt of a different kind, one that couldn't be paid with cash. For a week, she drifted through the house, a ghost in purgatory. The immediate threat was gone, but her future was a terrifying, formless void. Her name was ruined in the financial circles Ethan had dragged her through. Her friends, the fair weather, high society crowd she had cultivated, had vanished the moment her glamorous life evaporated. She was 38 years old, with no home, no husband, no job, and a gap in her resume that was filled with nothing but a disastrous marriage. She had hit bottom. One evening, I found her sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the help-wanted section of the local newspaper, a part of the paper I was sure she never knew existed. Her expression was one of profound shock, the look of a queen forced to inspect the living conditions of the peasantry for the first time. "I need a job," she said, the words a stark, unbelievable admission. "I need to earn money." She said the words as if they were a foreign language she was just learning to speak. Her entire adult life had been subsidized first by Robert and me, then by Ethan's smoke and mirrors financing. The concept of trading her time and labor for a paycheck was completely alien to her. She had no marketable skills, not really. Her art history degree was a decade-old relic. Her work experience consisted of serving on charity boards and managing their lavish Back Bay apartment. She was, as she was coming to realize, completely and utterly useless in the real world. The job she finally found was as far from her old life as it was possible to get. It was a night shift cleaning position for a commercial sanitation company. Her assignment, a cavernous, empty office building in the financial district, ironically just a few blocks from the glittering towers where Ethan had pretended to be a captain of industry. The first night she went to work, I watched her from the kitchen window. She was dressed in old jeans and a sweatshirt, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, her hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked like a different person. Smaller, younger, humbled. She walked to the bus stop at the end of the street, her shoulders slumped, a small lunch bag I had packed for her clutched in her hand. She was stepping into a world she had never known, a world of fluorescent lights, industrial-grade cleaning chemicals, and the quiet, invisible labor that keeps the city running while people like her are asleep. The work was brutal, and it was meant to be. It was 10-hour shifts of emptying trash cans, vacuuming endless hallways, scrubbing toilets, and polishing floors that would be dirtied again in a few hours. It was a Sisyphean task, a nightly confrontation with meaninglessness. She would come home just as the sun was rising, her face etched with a fatigue so deep it seemed to have settled in her bones. She smelled of bleach and floor wax. She would shower, crawl into her childhood bed, and sleep the exhausted, dreamless sleep of the truly spent. We barely spoke during this time, but the atmosphere in the house began to change. The thick, suffocating tension started to dissipate, replaced by a quiet, shared routine. I would leave a thermos of coffee for her on the counter before she left. She would wash her own dishes before she went to bed. They were small, almost imperceptible gestures, but they were the first green shoots of something new growing in the scorched earth of our relationship. One morning, about a month into her new job, she came home later than usual. She looked different. Not just tired, but thoughtful. She made herself a cup of tea and sat down at the kitchen table, her movements slow and deliberate. "I had a conversation last night," she said, not looking at me, "with one of the other cleaners. Her name is Mrs. Carver. She must be your age. Been doing this for 30 years. I waited, saying nothing. She saw me sitting in the break room, just staring at the wall, I guess. And she sat down next to me. She was quiet for a minute. Then she asked me a question." Angela paused, swallowing hard. "She asked me if I was a woman who never had any chances, or if I was a woman who had wasted them all." The question hung in the quiet kitchen. It was a simple, devastatingly direct question from a woman who had likely seen it all. "What did you say?" I asked softly. Angela finally looked at me, and her eyes were filled with a clear, painful, and unvarnished honesty. It was the first truly honest look she had given me in years. "I told her I wasted them," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I told her I had been given every chance in the world, and I threw them all away." She broke down then, but it was a different kind of crying. It wasn't the hysterical, self-pitying sobbing of her return. It was the quiet, ragged, cleansing grief of a woman mourning her own squandered life. I went to her and, for the first time since she had come home, I placed my hand on her shoulder. She leaned into my touch, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was a connection, a beginning. She was still at the bottom. She was still scrubbing floors in the dark while the city slept. But for the first time, she was finally looking up, not for a lifeline, but at the steep, hard climb she knew she had to make on her own. The humility had begun. While Angela was learning the brutal catechism of humility one scrubbed floor at a time, I was moving through a different world, a world of quiet, calculated strategy. Her journey was one of emotional and physical exhaustion. Mine was a campaign of silent, legal warfare waged on her behalf, a war she knew nothing about. Our tentative peace was fragile, built on the unspoken truce of her nightly labor and my silent provision of shelter. We existed in a state of quiet coexistence. The gaping wounds between us had not healed, they had simply been bandaged. I knew that the tourniquet she had applied by selling the family jewelry was a temporary measure. The world of legal and financial consequences, the world Ethan had built and then abandoned, was a patient predator. It was circling, waiting. And I could not, would not, allow her to be its final meal. My lesson was about rebuilding her character, not allowing a con man to completely annihilate her future. My regular meetings with George Miller continued, but their purpose had shifted. The initial phase of reclamation was over. We had secured the assets. Now, we were on the offensive, but it was a stealth operation. George, with the methodical patience of a chess master, had tasked Fitzpatrick, the investigator, with a new, more complex objective: to build an impenetrable legal firewall between Angela and the radioactive toxicity of Ethan's life. The creditors she paid off are the tip of the iceberg, Anne. George had explained to me in his office, his voice grave. Those were the street-level thugs. Ethan was operating in a more sophisticated cesspool. The real danger isn't the men who make threats on the phone, it's the ones who file liens, the ones who use the courts to claw back every penny. We need to prove that she wasn't his partner. We need to prove she was his mark. It was a delicate, painstaking process. Fitzpatrick became a ghost, tracing the digital and paper trail of Ethan's life. He unearthed corporate filings for shell companies, tracked wire transfers to offshore accounts, and interviewed former business associates who had been charmed, fleeced, and left in his wake. A picture began to emerge, far darker than I had imagined. Ethan wasn't just a debtor, he was a professional fraud. The first major breakthrough came from a forensic accountant George had hired. He analyzed the documents for the European deal, the ones Ethan had used to convince Angela to liquidate my assets. They were forgeries. Sophisticated, but undeniable forgeries. The signatures of the supposed European investors were fake, the corporate letterheads fabricated. He had built an entire fictional enterprise, a Potemkin village of success, designed for an audience of one, my daughter. This was our first crucial piece of evidence. It proved she had acted on information that was, from its inception, a lie. I held the accountant's report in my hands, a thick, spiral-bound document filled with charts and analyses. It was the anatomy of a grand deception. Reading it, I felt a cold knot of anger tighten in my stomach. This man hadn't just stolen my money. He had poisoned my daughter's mind, twisting her ambition and her desires into a weapon he could use against her, and against me. But the most damning discovery was yet to come. Fitzpatrick, in his quiet, relentless digging, uncovered something that made even George Miller sit back in his chair and let out a long, slow whistle. While they were in Europe, in the final days before the money ran out, Ethan had done something truly desperate, truly depraved. He had convinced Angela to marry him again, in a small, civil ceremony in a jurisdiction known for its lax financial laws. He had sold it to her, no doubt, as a romantic, spontaneous gesture. But its true purpose was insidious. The marriage, under that country's law, would have automatically made all of her assets and any potential inheritance community property instantly liable for all of his debts. It was a last-ditch, legalistic smash and grab. He was trying to lash her to his sinking ship so he could use her as a lifeboat. But the final, critical detail was what turned his depravity into our salvation. Fitzpatrick obtained a copy of the marriage certificate. And the signature, the one attributed to Angela West, was not hers. It was close, a skilled imitation, but under the unforgiving eye of a handwriting expert, it was a clear and demonstrable forgery. George laid the two documents side by side on his polished mahogany desk. The expert's affidavit and a copy of the sham marriage certificate. "This is it, Anne," he said, his voice ringing with a quiet, fierce satisfaction. "This is the silver bullet." He didn't just lie to her, he didn't just manipulate her. He committed a blatant, provable act of identity theft and fraud against her. He tried to legally bind her to his crimes without her consent. No court in the world will see her as a co-conspirator now. She's his victim. Full stop. The plan was to use this evidence to systematically dismantle every financial claim against her. George began drafting letters to the more legitimate creditors, the ones who used law firms instead of thugs. He laid out the case in cold, irrefutable terms. Their claims were against Ethan West, a man who had defrauded not only them, but his own wife. Any funds he had used from her were obtained under false pretenses, and they would find themselves on the losing end of a countersuit if they persisted. It was a masterful piece of legal intimidation, and it worked. One by one, the threats began to recede. The circling predators, sensing a fight they couldn't win, began to back away. All of this was happening in a world Angela knew nothing about. She was still getting up in the dark, still taking the bus to her thankless job, still coming home smelling of bleach. She was living her life of penance, unaware of the legal armor I was secretly forging for her. I kept the news from her, a decision that felt both necessary and profoundly difficult. It was a heavy secret to carry. I would watch her at the kitchen table, her face etched with a weary resignation, and my heart would ache with the urge to tell her, to lift the burden, to say, "It's okay. You're safe." But I knew I couldn't. Not yet. Her transformation, her journey toward humility, was still too fragile. To rescue her now would be to rob her of the very lesson she was so painfully learning, that actions have consequences, and that true strength comes not from being saved, but from finding the will to save yourself. If I revealed my hand too soon, she would see me as the source of her salvation, the provider of the solution, the same role I had always played. She would revert to a state of dependency. She needed to believe, for a little while longer, that she was utterly and completely alone in her struggle. The knowledge that a secret fortune and a team of legal experts were fighting for her would have been a drug, and she was just beginning to learn how to live sober. The cost of this secret was a continued distance between us. Our conversations remained clipped, practical. "There's leftover chicken in the fridge. Don't forget your lunch. The bus is running 5 minutes late this morning." It was the language of roommates, not of a mother and daughter. But I saw the changes in her, small but significant. She started reading books from the library instead of staring at her phone. She spoke of Mrs. Carver, her elderly coworker, with a genuine, quiet respect. She was slowly, painstakingly rebuilding her life from the ground up, with no expectation of help. One evening, I came into the kitchen and found her writing a check. It was for a small amount, made out to me. "What's this?" I asked. She slid it across the table, not meeting my eyes. "It's for rent," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And for groceries. It's not much. It's all I have left after everything else. But it's a start." I looked at the check. The amount was trivial. It wouldn't even cover the cost of the electricity she used. But it was the most significant financial transaction of her life. It wasn't money she had been given, or money she had schemed for, or money she had stolen. It was money she had earned. Earned through sweat and exhaustion, through the humbling, back-breaking labor of cleaning up other people's messes. I pushed the check back across the table. "I don't want your money, Angela." She looked up, a flash of the old, defensive pride in her eyes. "I have to pay my way." "I know," I said gently. "But you're already paying. This," I tapped the check, "is just paper. What you're doing every night, that's real. That's the payment that matters." It was the most honest, direct conversation we had had since her return. A flicker of understanding passed between us. It was a fragile, momentary truce in our silent war, an acknowledgement of the painful, necessary journey she was on. I knew the time was coming soon when I would have to tell her everything, when the legal net George was casting was finally and completely closed. The day was approaching when I would take her back to George's office and lay out the entire, secret history of the past few months. But I would not do it until the case was airtight, until her freedom from Ethan was an absolute, undeniable fact. Because when I finally told her, I didn't want it to feel like a rescue. I wanted it to feel like a release. A release she had earned. She had hit the bottom, and with no help from me or anyone else, she had found the strength to start climbing. The legal machinery I had set in motion was just clearing the rocks from the path ahead. The climbing, she was finally learning, she had to do for herself. The day I chose was a crisp, clear morning in late autumn. The maple trees on our street had shed their fiery leaves, leaving a stark, honest latticework of branches against a brilliant blue sky. It was a day for clarity, for stripping things down to their essential truths. The final pieces of George Miller's legal strategy had clicked into place the afternoon before. The last of the major creditors had formally withdrawn their claims against Angela. The case was airtight. The war, the one she never knew was being fought, was over. I found her in the kitchen, washing her work uniform in the sink by hand, a small, domestic act of self-sufficiency that would have been unthinkable just a few months prior. She looked up as I entered, her eyes weary from another night shift, but clear. The frantic, haunted look was gone, replaced by a kind of settled, quiet resignation. I need you to come with me this morning, I said, my voice even. There's someone I need you to meet, Dad. She looked down at her damp, work-worn hands, a flicker of insecurity on her face. Like this? I'm not really dressed to go anywhere. You're fine, I said. It's not a social call, it's an appointment. She didn't argue. The dynamic between us had solidified into a new kind of normal. She had learned, through her harsh new reality, to cede control. She trusted my judgment, not because she understood my motives, but because she had lost all faith in her own. She simply dried her hands, put on a clean sweater, and followed me out to the car. The drive downtown was silent, but it was a different silence than the one we had shared on our trip to the bank. That had been a silence thick with her frantic hope and my secret knowledge. This was a silence of quiet anticipation. She didn't ask where we were going. She just watched the city go by, her expression unreadable. When I pulled up in front of the stately, old brick building that housed George Miller's law firm, she looked at the brass plaque by the door, her brow furrowing in confusion. A lawyer? Mom, what is this? I can't afford a lawyer. I know, I said. Just come with me. George was waiting for us in his conference room. It was a formidable space, lined with leather-bound books that smelled of history and consequence. A long, polished table reflected the cool morning light. George stood as we entered, a tall, impeccably dressed man whose calm demeanor radiated a quiet, unshakable authority. He nodded to me, a look of understanding in his eyes, then turned his gaze to Angela. Miss West, he said, his voice polite but formal. Thank you for coming. Please, have a seat. Angela looked from George to me, her confusion deepening. She sat down tentatively, perching on the edge of one of the heavy leather chairs as if she expected to be asked to leave at any moment. I sat beside her, a silent partner in this final, critical act. George took his seat opposite us and folded his hands on the table. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He looked directly at Angela. Miss West, he began, for the past several months, at the instruction of your mother, my firm has been engaged in a comprehensive review of the financial and legal entanglements created by your husband, Ethan West. Angela flinched at the sound of Ethan's name. Her eyes darted to me, a flicker of panic in them. What had I done? What new trouble had I dragged her into? George continued, his voice the calm, dispassionate instrument of fact. He laid it all out, a concise, devastating summary of their investigation. He spoke of the fabricated European deal, the forged documents, the trail of corporate fraud. He spoke of the mountain of debt Ethan had accrued, not as a failed businessman, but as a systematic predator. With each sentence, Angela seemed to shrink further into her chair, the full, documented history of her husband's deceit washing over her. Then, George slid a document across the table. It was the handwriting expert's affidavit. And then there is this, he said. A marriage certificate, filed in a foreign jurisdiction during your recent trip to Europe. A marriage that would have made you legally liable for 100% of Mr. West's fraudulent debts. He paused, letting the weight of the statement land. However, as you can see from this analysis, the signature on the document is not yours. It is a forgery. Angela stared at the paper, her own name signed by another hand. Her face went ashen. She had, I realized, a vague memory of the event, a quick, rushed ceremony Ethan had passed off as a romantic whim, but she had been so caught up in the fantasy, so desperate to believe, that she had signed what he put in front of her without truly understanding its purpose. Or, as the evidence now proved, he had simply signed it for her. It was the ultimate violation, the final, absolute proof that she had never been his partner, only his prey. We have used this evidence, George continued, his voice steady, to systematically dismantle every legal and financial claim against you. We have proven, beyond any legal doubt, that you were not a co-conspirator in Mr. West's activities, but a victim of them. As of yesterday afternoon, the last of the significant civil claims against you have been formally withdrawn. Legally, Angela, you are clear. The words hung in the silent, sunlit room. You are clear. Angela just stared at him, then at the documents, her mind struggling to process the information. She had been living for months under the crushing weight of a debt she could never repay, a constant, low-grade terror of the phone ringing, of a knock on the door. And now, in the space of a few minutes, that weight had been lifted. She looked like a prisoner who had been led into the sunlight and told, abruptly, that her life sentence had been commuted. She didn't look relieved. She just looked, stunned. Her first words were a ragged whisper. I don't understand. This must have cost a fortune. The investigators, the accountants, you. I don't have any money. How? Her gaze finally settled on me, and in her eyes, I saw the dawning of a new, even more profound confusion. The question was obvious. Where had the money come from? How had I, the quiet, cash-strapped widow, orchestrated this sophisticated legal rescue? This was the moment. The second act of the reveal. The part of the lesson where the true scope of the world was finally laid bare. I looked at George, and he gave me a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He slid a second, much thicker folder across the table. Angela, I said, my voice quiet but carrying the weight of the last 4 months. There are some things you don't know. Things your father put in place a long time ago to protect our family. Her hands trembled as she opened the folder. Inside was not the language of crisis and legal defense, but the language of wealth and power. There was a summary of the Parker Holdings LLC portfolio. There were deeds to properties she had never heard of. There were statements from a private wealth management firm, showing balances with a shocking, unbelievable number of zeros. And on top of it all was the deed to the building at 1247 Commonwealth Avenue. Her building. With the new owner listed in stark, black ink. Ann Parker. She stared at the papers, her face a maelstrom of shock, disbelief, and a dawning, horrified comprehension. She looked from the deed to my face, her mouth opening and closing silently. The mysterious, hostile entity that had evicted her, Parker Holdings LLC, the force that had ripped her from her home and sent her life into a tailspin, was not a stranger, it was me. It had been me all along. The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of a world being turned inside out. Why? She finally whispered, the word a fragile exhalation. It was the only question that mattered. Why would you do this? Why would you let me suffer like that? The job, the humiliation, living in that little room, if you had all of this, why would you watch me go through that? Her voice was not accusatory. It was filled with a raw, genuine, and painful incomprehension. It was the question I had been waiting for. It was the heart of the entire lesson. I leaned forward, my hands flat on the cool, polished table, and I met her gaze without flinching. Because the money was never the problem, Angela, I said, my voice firm but not unkind. The money was the disease. It was a poison that was rotting you from the inside out. Your father saw it, and after he was gone, I saw it too. I told her everything then. I told her about Robert's letter, about his fears for her, about his quiet, 30-year plan to build a fortress. I told her about the phone calls she had made from the airport, the casual, brutal way she had informed me she had sold the cottage and the Mustang. You didn't see those things as a home or a memory, Angela. You saw them as a resource. An obstacle to be liquidated for your convenience. You had stopped seeing me as your mother. You saw me as an asset to be managed. An estate to be settled before I was even dead. Tears were streaming down her face now, silent, hot tears of shame. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. The truth was there, undeniable, in the cold light of that room. I didn't let you suffer, I continued, my voice softening slightly. I let you work. I let you feel the consequences of your own choices for the first time in your life. I let you discover what it felt like to earn something, to be responsible for yourself, to stand on your own 2 feet without a safety net woven from someone else's money. The woman who walked into this office today is not the same woman who flew to Europe 4 months ago. That woman was weak. She was a follower. She was a child in a designer suit. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers. Her skin was cool, and her hand was no longer the soft, manicured hand of a society wife. It was the hand of a worker, the knuckles slightly rough, the nails clean but short. This woman, I said, looking her directly in the eye, is strong. She's a survivor. I didn't want to rescue you, Angela. I wanted to meet her. And I needed to know that she could exist before I could trust you with any of this. I gestured to the folder, to the incredible, life-altering wealth it represented. This is not a reward, it's a responsibility. It's the cottage, restored. It's your father's car, waiting in a garage. It's a legacy of hard work and careful planning. What you do with it now, that's up to you. But you will do it as a partner, as a daughter who has finally learned the meaning of family, of respect, and of a hard day's work. You have been cleared of your legal debts, Angela. But the real work, the work of rebuilding your life with purpose and integrity, that starts today. She sat there for a long time, her head bowed, her silent tears dripping onto the deed of the building she once called home. The sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The armor I had secretly forged for her had been revealed. The mercy I had withheld had finally been granted. But it was a mercy with a spine of steel. It was not a pardon, it was a promotion. A promotion to a life of consequence. Leaving George Miller's office was like stepping out of a pressurized cabin into the open air. The world seemed both sharper and quieter. Angela was dazed, moving with the slow, deliberate care of a person relearning the laws of gravity. She carried the thick folder of documents not like a prize, but like a fragile, impossibly heavy object she was terrified of dropping. The information contained within it, the staggering wealth, the secret history, the raw, unvarnished truth of my actions, was a universe she had not yet learned how to navigate. The drive home was a mirror image of the one that morning, a journey back from a verdict. But this time, the silence was not one of tension or confusion. It was the silence of absorption. I could almost feel the tectonic plates of her reality shifting, grinding against each other as she struggled to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she now was, and the incredible, terrifying new landscape that lay before her. I expected an explosion of questions, a torrent of emotions: relief, anger, gratitude, confusion. Instead, there was just that profound, echoing quiet. When we walked back into my small house in Jamaica Plain, it felt different. For months, it had been her refuge and her prison. Now, it was simply a starting point. She went upstairs to her childhood room and closed the door. I let her go. This was a battle she had to fight alone, the battle to integrate the harshest of lessons with the most incredible of gifts. I did not see her for the rest of the day. But that evening, just as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a sound from downstairs. It was the familiar, mundane sound of the front door opening and closing. I looked out the window and saw her, a small, determined figure walking down the sidewalk in the deepening twilight, her lunch bag in her hand. She was heading to the bus stop. She was going to work. The choice was so simple, so unexpected, and so profoundly significant that it took my breath away. With a fortune now at her fingertips, with the knowledge that she could walk away from the bleach and the drudgery forever, she had chosen to honor her commitment. She had chosen to finish her shift. In that single, quiet act of responsibility, she gave me the first glimmer of hope that the lesson had truly landed, that the woman I had hoped to meet was not a fleeting visitor, but was here to stay. This became the new pattern of our lives. The folder of documents sat on the desk in her room, a silent testament to her new reality, but she did not open it. Instead, she continued to work. She scrubbed floors. She came home exhausted at dawn. She paid me her small, symbolic rent. It was as if she knew, on some deep, instinctual level, that she could not touch that new life until she had properly finished with the old one. She was living a life of penance, not because I was forcing her to, but because she was forcing herself. She was building a foundation of character, stone by painful stone, before she dared to step into the castle. Slowly, tentatively, we began to talk. Not about the money, not about the past. We talked about her work. She told me about Mrs. Carver, her elderly co-worker, whose husband was sick and whose social security barely covered their rent. She spoke of another cleaner, a young single mother from El Salvador who was working 2 jobs to send money home to her family. For the first time, Angela was seeing the world not from the penthouse, but from the basement. She was seeing the quiet, grinding realities of lives lived on the margins, lives of incredible dignity and resilience in the face of relentless hardship. The world was no longer a backdrop for her ambitions, it was a tapestry of real human stories, and she was finally a part of it. One payday, she came home with a small bag of groceries. Not just for herself, but for the house. And another, smaller bag. "This is for Mrs. Carver," she said, her cheeks coloring slightly. "Her husband likes this brand of tea. I thought it might be nice." It was a small gesture, an act of quiet, targeted generosity. But the money she had used to buy that tea was her own, earned from 10 hours of scrubbing toilets. It was more valuable, more meaningful, than any $1,000 check she had ever written for a charity gala. She wasn't performing philanthropy anymore. She was practicing kindness. She also started taking the bus to the public library in the afternoons before her shift. She came home one day with a stack of course catalogs from the local state university, not a prestigious, private institution, but a commuter school for working people. "I was thinking," she said, avoiding my gaze as she spread them on the kitchen table, "about what I want to do. For real. And it's not art history." She looked at the brochures for social work, for counseling, for nonprofit management. "All those people I work with, they have so many problems. Not just money problems. They need help navigating the system, finding resources." I thought, maybe I could be useful. Useful. The word struck me with the force of a revelation. Her entire life had been a quest to be important, to be admired, to be successful. Now, all she wanted was to be useful. Robert's lesson, my lesson, was taking root in the most unexpected and beautiful of ways. Meanwhile, my own quiet life in Jamaica Plain was becoming more difficult to maintain. My neighbor, Nora, the retired nurse with the sharp eyes, had noticed the changes. She'd seen Angela coming and going at strange hours. She'd seen the lights on in my house late at night. The narrative of the frail, struggling widow was beginning to wear thin. One afternoon, she caught me in the garden. "Anne," she said, her voice a mixture of concern and unvarnished curiosity. "I don't mean to pry, but I saw that nice man in the suit dropping your daughter off the other day. And I saw the car. A Lincoln Town car. That's not a taxi." She was referring to the car service George occasionally used to send documents to the house. I had been caught. The facade was cracking. I looked at Nora, at her kind, intelligent face. For months, I had held this enormous secret, carrying its weight alone. And in that moment, I realized I didn't have to anymore. "Can you come in for some tea, Nora?" I asked. There's something I'd like to tell you." We sat at my kitchen table, and I told her. Not every sordid detail, but the broad strokes. I told her about Robert's foresight, about Angela's terrible mistakes, and about the quiet, complex plan to force her to reclaim her own soul. Nora listened, her teacup poised in her hand, her expression unchanging. She was a nurse. She had a professional's capacity for absorbing shocking information without judgment. When I finished, she was silent for a long time. She finally set her cup down and looked at me, her eyes shining with a fierce, unexpected admiration. "My God, Anne," she said, her voice a hushed whisper. "Everyone on this block thinks you're a fragile little bird. You're not, you're a hawk." She shook her head, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Robert always did say you were the toughest woman he ever met." I guess he was right. Her validation was a gift. To finally share the burden, to be seen not as a victim or a grieving widow, but as a strategist, a protector, it was an indescribable relief. From that day on, Nora became my confidant, a silent, knowing ally in my quiet suburban life. A few weeks later, Angela came home from work with a look of quiet triumph on her face. She held up an acceptance letter. She had been admitted to the social work certificate program at the state university. Classes started in the spring. "I'm going to keep working nights," she said, her plan already formed. "I can go to class during the day. It'll be hard, but I can do it." "How will you pay for it?" I asked, the question a gentle test. "I've been saving," she said, a note of pride in her voice. "Every penny that didn't go to you for rent. It's enough for the first semester. After that, I'll figure it out. Go." She refused to touch the folder. She refused to take the easy way out. The wealth was there, a silent, glittering promise, but she was determined to build this new life with her own two hands. I looked at my daughter, her face tired from lack of sleep but illuminated from within by a newfound sense of purpose, and I felt a surge of love so powerful it almost hurt. The anger and the pain of the past months had receded, leaving this in its place, a deep, profound respect for the woman she was becoming. Robert had wanted to protect me. I had wanted to teach her a lesson. But in the end, what had happened was something far more transformative. She had learned to respect herself, and that was a gift far greater than any inheritance. The rebuilding had begun, not with money, but with purpose. The months that followed were a quiet testament to the profound, seismic shift that had occurred in our lives. The seasons turned, the stark branches of late autumn giving way to the hushed white blanket of a Boston winter, and with the changing of the seasons, a new kind of family began to take root within the walls of my small house. Angela's life fell into a grueling but purposeful rhythm. By night, she was a ghost in the empty canyons of the financial district, her hands raw from the chemicals, her body aching with the honest fatigue of hard labor. By day, she was a student, her mind grappling with the complex, human-centered problems of social work, her notebooks filling with theories on crisis intervention and community outreach. She was perpetually exhausted, but it was a different kind of exhaustion than the soul-deep weariness she'd brought home from Europe. This was the fatigue of effort, of purpose. The haunted look in her eyes was replaced by a focused intensity. The money, the vast, silent fortune represented by the folder that still sat, largely unopened, on her desk, was a fact of her life, but it was not the center of it. She was living as if it didn't exist, determined to earn her new future, not simply inherit it. The news about Ethan came on a gray, slushy afternoon in late February. It arrived not as a dramatic phone call, but as a clipped, professional email from George Miller. Fitzpatrick, at George's request, had kept a discreet, passive watch on his activities. Ethan's flight from justice had not been a long one. His luck, and his stolen cash, had run out in a small, non-extradition country where he had tried to set up a new series of shell corporations. But his greed had made him sloppy. He had defrauded a man with connections to the local government, a foolish, fatal mistake. He had been arrested, tried in a swift, merciless legal system, and sentenced to a long term in a prison notorious for its harsh conditions. I read the email, then forwarded it to Angela without comment. She read it on her phone, standing in the kitchen in her work clothes, getting ready to leave for her shift. I watched her face carefully, looking for any sign of lingering pain, or perhaps, a flicker of vindictive satisfaction. She showed neither. She simply read the email, her expression calm, and then looked up at me. "Good," she said, her voice quiet and devoid of malice. "It's over. He can't hurt anyone else." There was no anger, no triumph. Just a profound sense of closure. Ethan was no longer a monster haunting her past. He was just a sad, pathetic chapter in a book she had finished reading. His fate was his own, a consequence of a life lived in deceit. Her focus was on her own future, a future she was building with her own two hands. In that moment, I knew she was truly free of him. As spring began to breathe new life into the frozen city, Angela completed her social work certificate program. She graduated not in a cap and gown in some grand auditorium, but with a simple certificate that arrived in the mail. She held it in her hand, this flimsy piece of paper, and I saw more pride on her face than I had ever seen at her university graduation, paid for by Robert and me. This, she had earned. Her work with the cleaning company had given her more than just a paycheck, it had been an education. The stories of her co-workers, Mrs. Carver, the single mother from El Salvador, a dozen others had become a part of her. She'd spent her break times not scrolling through her phone, but helping them fill out forms for housing assistance, translating documents, and connecting them with legal aid resources she'd learned about in her classes. She was already doing the work, unpaid, in the fluorescent-lit break rooms of the city. She was accepted into the master's program in social work at the same state university. When the tuition bill arrived, she finally sat down at the desk in her room and opened the folder. But she didn't look at the portfolio statements with their dizzying balances. She looked for the documents pertaining to her own trust fund, a much smaller, separate account Robert had set up for her when she was born, an account Ethan had never been able to touch. It was modest, but it was enough. "I'm paying for this myself," she told me, showing me the withdrawal slip. "From my own account. The rest, the big stuff, we need to talk about that. We need to figure out what it's for. Go." That conversation was the beginning of the final, most important phase of our journey. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table that had witnessed her confession and her surrender, and we spread out the architecture of Robert's secret legacy. For the first time, we looked at it not as a personal fortune, but as a formidable tool. "He built a fortress to protect us," Angela said, her voice filled with a quiet awe as she looked at the list of properties, the portfolio of responsible, long-term investments. "But a fortress isn't meant to be lived in forever. It's meant to be a base. A place to launch from." Her vision, born from her late-night conversations with Mrs. Carver and her daytime studies of systemic poverty, was clear. She didn't see a life of leisure for herself. She saw a resource to be deployed. The wealth wasn't a cushion, it was an arsenal. Our first project was the apartment building in the Back Bay. Her old building. Instead of selling it for a massive profit, we established a new policy. A third of the units would be designated as subsidized housing, offered at a fraction of the market rate to women and families transitioning out of homeless shelters. The other tenants, paying the full, exorbitant Back Bay rent, would unknowingly be funding a quiet, radical experiment in economic integration in one of Boston's wealthiest neighborhoods. The second project was closer to my heart. The Cape Cottage. We had spent that summer slowly, lovingly restoring it, not just to its former glory, but to something more. We painted the walls a calm, soothing sea glass green. We filled it with comfortable furniture, warm quilts, and a fully stocked pantry. It was no longer a monument to my past, but a promise for someone else's future. In the early fall, we officially opened it. In partnership with a local women's shelter, the cottage became a short-term refuge, a place where a woman escaping an abusive situation or sudden financial abandonment could stay, free of charge, for up to a month. It was a place to breathe, a place to heal, a place to stand on the porch and watch the tide come in and believe, for the first time in a long time, that the world was not an entirely hostile place. It was during this time that I realized the true nature of the change in our relationship. We were no longer just mother and daughter. We were partners. We would spend hours at the kitchen table, spreadsheets and legal documents spread out between us, debating the merits of a new investment, planning the budget for the foundation we were creating in Robert's name. She brought her newfound knowledge of social systems and her fierce, focused passion. I brought my lifetime of quiet observation and the steady, guiding hand of Robert's original intent. One crisp October afternoon, we drove down to the Cape to deliver a new set of linens to the cottage. A young woman and her small son were staying there, having fled a violent husband with nothing but the clothes on their backs. We saw them from a distance, walking on the beach, the little boy chasing the gulls, his laughter carrying on the salty air. His mother watched him, a small, tentative smile on her face. It was the first time she had smiled in a year, the shelter director had told us. Angela stood beside me, watching the scene. Her face was calm, her eyes clear. The ambitious, grasping woman who had sold this view for a pittance was gone forever, replaced by this quiet, purposeful woman who was now giving it away to a stranger in need. Dad would have liked this, she said softly. Yes, I said, my throat tight with emotion. He would have. We had come full circle. We had taken the legacy of a quiet, brilliant man, a legacy of love and protection, and we had transformed it. It was no longer a shield to hide behind. It was a shelter to be shared. We had chosen each other not out of obligation or dependency, but as equals, as partners in a new and vital mission. We were using wealth not as a measure of success, but as a tool for dignity, for healing, and for service. I looked at my daughter, her face turned toward the sea, a quiet strength in her profile that had been forged in the harshest of fires, and I knew the lesson was complete. Robert hadn't just left me a fortune. He had, in his own wise, roundabout way, given me back my daughter. And he had given her back to herself. This story is a powerful reminder that true strength is often quiet, underestimated, and forged in betrayal. It teaches that the greatest act of love may not be a swift rescue, but allowing someone to face the full, humbling consequences of their choices. Redemption isn't gifted, it's earned through the dignity of hard work. Ultimately, our truest legacy is not the wealth we accumulate, but the character we build. Wealth finds its highest purpose only when it is transformed from a private fortune into a public good, a tool for healing, shelter, and second chances. Now, if you liked this story, give it a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me which part surprised you the most. Each subscription and comment from you is a great motivation for us to keep sharing more meaningful things in life. Thank you very much.